Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a new website, then get your domain name and web hosting through Bluehost. Bluehost is easy to use, has great customer support, and easily integrates with WordPress, Google Workspace, and numerous other online tools. Plus, if you get your hosting at my link, then you could potentially get your site promoted via this podcast. Get your hosting through Bluehost at placesandprofiles.com/blue. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Tracy Laird about the history and cultural significance of country music. Tracy is Harry L., Corin Bryant, and Cotty Beverly Slade Professor of Music in the Creative Arts Department at Agnes Scott College. She is an author or editor of 6 books, including most recently Dolly Parton, 100 Remarkable Moments in an Extraordinary Life. Her perspective on the 21st century concluded the 4th and 50th anniversary editions of Bill Malone's seminal Country Music USA. She is also the author of Louisiana Hayride, Radio and Roots Music Along the Red River, and Austin City Limits, A History. For more information, please check out the show notes page for today's episode at placesandprofiles.com/23. Tracy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, thank you so much. So our topic today is the history and cultural significance of country music. So let's start out with some definitions and some very early background. So what is country music, and when and where did it start?
I think that's actually a more complicated question than it seems on the surface, because what we think of right now as the commercial country music industry really gets its start in the 1920s with the takeoff of record and radio industries, sort of starting that as a business. But then in the background, you've got all kinds of music making happening that are sort of the stuff of what we now think of as country music. In my mind, part of what is happening recently in our understanding of country music is the ways in which sort of the categories that define the genre are all mixed up in our nation's history and culture. And that includes the good and the bad. That includes the fact that we're looking at an era of Jim Crow segregation when these industry categories were established, and they were conceived of at their commercial beginnings on racially delineated terms. And so I think now what we're seeing in recent country music scholarship is a reckoning with the social realities of the time and how they shaped our paradigms and how they may have obscured, for example, all the important music making that's happening among white Southerners and Black Southerners that are part of this history that really need to be reclaimed to fully understand the mixed roots of country music and really every genre in the United States. I think country music stands out as, one of a handful of musics that happen here in this country, in this place, and nowhere else because of the mixed roots. And that, like I say, those are components worth celebrating. They're also components that are sorrowful and woeful in our past that need to be reckoned. So I think that when you're talking about commercial country now, there is an association with white culture that you have to understand is specifically rooted in that past. As far as definitions go, I mean, you're talking about music with traditional instruments, guitar, fiddle, and banjos. You're talking about people writing songs that, at its heart, tell stories. Country music is famously, it's not the only kind of country music, but at its heart, it's a storytelling music that takes you into a vignette. Usually it's something that people really relate to, everyday kinds of scenarios. There's also a wonderful part of our tradition that is all the contradictions in other ways of our culture. traditionally in country music, you say the Saturday night versus the Sunday morning, the spectra of sin and sacredness. Those are all elements of country music that at its best are coming into relation with each other and sort of playing out across time in all the ways that, every human deals with those things. It's a long, winding answer.
Yeah, it is, but it really sheds a lot of insight. So let's go back to the origins again of country music. And you mentioned that there are a lot of different things that are influencing the early years of country music and the early shape that country music takes in the decades that precede what we might think of as the modern commercialized country music industry. So can you talk a little more about some of the things that were influencing the early years of country music and some of the types of music that were influencing country music in its earliest of days?
Well, so as far as types of music, you think about before the era of recording and radio, what were people doing with music? What was its purpose and what was its function in different scenarios? So, people who lived in farming life, for example, would bring out fiddles and different instruments depending on where you are. Fiddles, guitars. Fiddles are louder to have a Saturday night dance, for example, to pass the time. So you're looking at fiddle music. You're looking at people with guitar and songwriting just on their porches, passing the time. You're looking at minstrelsy gets in there some in terms of influences and the shaping of how songs are constructed and the spreading of songs. And, and then in terms of, I guess, string bands, all of this is part of the distant past of pre-recording that to some extent is left up to imaginations, but also some of the earliest recordings that we have. When you think about early examples of recording artists making music across the kind of boundary lines that we have that I was talking about before, string bands is one of my favorite. And that crosses all kinds of boundaries, people getting together just to jam.
Now, if we had to put a location to the beginning of country music, because nowadays a lot of people will associate country music with the southern United States, and that's been the case for decades. If we had to put a specific location or region of the U.S. to country music, where would we put it? Would this be in the Smokies in East Tennessee? Would this be more spreading throughout much of rural Appalachia? Where would we kind of trace the origins in a geographic sense?
Traditionally, the story of music does begin the story of country music does begin in Appalachia. And I think that part of my research journey that excited me early on is what happens when you start that story someplace else. For example, if you start that story in Louisiana, then suddenly the bigger picture, it's not that the Appalachian origins are not true. They are true. They're just not the full truth. So when you start that story in Louisiana, then suddenly you're looking at the music of Cajun and Creole residents also being an important part of the larger soundscape. And it equips you to ask different questions. So I think that generally speaking, I would put the origins of generally speaking, I would put the origins of country music in the South. But I would say, it looks one way in rural Appalachia. It looks another way in rural Southern Georgia. It looks another way the farther west you travel as people moved. So from the Piedmont region to Louisiana, that's where a lot of settlement of whites happened in the mid-1900s or mid-19th century, the 1800s. The story looks a little different, and all the impulses look richer, I think. Now, no one would argue now that Cajun music is a kind of subset of country music. But if you start your story or center your story in one place, it kind of doesn't leave you room to reckon all that. And I think this true, I know less about this, but it's true of northern parts of the United States and even southern parts of Canada as well, where people are making, again, music with fiddles. Those are portable instruments. Fiddles, banjos, guitars, portable instruments, and those are the rural, community-focused, often dance-based origins, and it doesn't just happen in one place. Early research on country music, I think, lifted up the Appalachia as a center, and there was a lot of good reason for that. There was kind of a story that got told and retold about the important connections with balladry tradition from, the British Isles. And that's certainly true. That's an important background. But I think it was perhaps overemphasized to the extent that early researchers, people like, Cecil Sharp, who went around in Appalachia to try to document in the early 1900s these holdovers. I think, sometimes a researcher can be looking so fixated on what they're looking for that they're missing what else is there. And so in the case of Appalachia, you might find people, and he did find people who could sing these old ancient ballads. They also could sing popular music that they heard on a phonograph record. They could also, sing popular music that a traveling vaudevillian came through and shared some songs. But the research at the time was really, hyper focused in one area. And I think it's a more rich picture when you open that up and, to well, what else are these people singing? Because nobody lives in isolation. And there was a kind of, I think, hyper focused impulse to create a picture of isolated people. Because it told a good story. It just was an incomplete story.
Sure. And of course, in addition to the tremendous geographic variety that we see during the origins of country music, as you've pointed out, there's a tremendous variety of musical influences that are going to ultimately shape what we come to view as country music. So as you said, some of the balladry from the British Isles, folk music, gospel music, bluegrass. There are a wide variety of types of music that influence country music in its origins. And then, of course, later on, rock and roll music, pop music. We see some types of music that maybe didn't exist when country music first came into existence that are going to influence country music in the decades and years ahead as well.
Absolutely. And I think there's a holdover from that period of early research and a fixation on purity that we still see in country music today. There's no other genre, I think, of U.S. music that is more subject to questions or kind of, clothes renting, breast beating about authenticity and purity as there have been traditionally about country music. And I think it traces back to that original framing that was really interested in those questions. And I think they've given way to broader and I would say more interesting questions than purity.
Sure. Now, I do want to shift our focus to talking about specific individuals that have shaped country music. But before we do that, can you just tell us about the term country music? Where does this come from? What should we take away from the fact that this type of music, out of all the types of music, is the one that is called country? Like, what should we take away from just the very term that we're discussing here today?
Well, I think we have to go back to the 20s and the emergence of the categories of popular music industry. Originally, if it was a music maker who was Black, it was called race music. And that was a term that was in parlance at the time. Black thought leaders would talk about the race, uplifting the race during the Harlem Renaissance. And so it was a common term that we don't hear very much now. if it was a white music maker, it was called in the beginning old time, hillbilly, sometimes folk. And eventually those categories emerged and changed and became rhythm and blues for Black music makers, and originally country and Western. And there was a big push to stop using the term hillbilly for its pejorative associations. Where this is happening, pretty sure in the late 40s. The late 40s. And to replace that with country and Western. And then gradually country and Western, the Western got dropped and it just became country music. And so that's really how it happened.
All right. So when we look at the earliest periods of country music, who would you say are some of the key figures, some of the key artists and performers that we should really know in order to be able to attempt to understand this period of country music?
I think there's two, classic recording artists that if you were a new student of country music, you have to listen to Jimmie Rodgers, the blue yodeler, and the original father of country music. And I think what we're talking about in terms of a place to potentially complicate the story, I mean, he's performing and recording blues, blues forms, and definitely partaking of that culture. I think the other probably standout artists that you just would have to listen to would be the Carter family. And that for a variety of reasons, partly the breadth of their repertoire, the innovation of Mother Maybelle Carter as a guitar player who, had a distinct style that has influenced guitar players long after her. When I say the breadth of their repertoire, I mean, traditional kind of folk tunes, hymnody, new songs. They're doing a lot with the one element of the music that we haven't really talked about are the tight harmonies. So they're doing vocal harmonies on their music, and so those would be good starting places. But then you could also dig into corners, some of the brother duets that are just a guitar and a banjo or a guitar and a fiddle doing close harmonies. Those are wonderful old recordings. There's old Jimmie Davis. Jimmie Davis was the artist who was famously associated and was given songwriting credit for "You Are My Sunshine," one of the most well-known examples of U.S. popular music across the globe. But his early recordings are very bawdy and kind of rambling. Some of them are very sort of through composed as he's creating these scenarios. He's recording with Black musicians in his Louisiana community early on in his career. And so there's a lot of, small things like that you could break open, looking for new questions and new directions to take your inquiry as well.
Well, and you mentioned Jimmie Davis in there. Of course, he also serves 2 terms as governor of Louisiana. So we begin to see how country music is not just influencing the music world, but how these individuals, these artists, even back in these earlier days, are having larger impact on the culture and so many other areas of American society.
Yeah, that's true. And he certainly was a great example. There was another governor of Texas, Pappy O'Daniel, who also famously incorporated country music into his campaigns. Jimmie Davis was a music maker himself, so it took a little bit of a different form there. But I think part of what they were tapping into was also the nostalgia that has traditionally been associated with country music. So that's been since it's, one of the first, if you go back to the question you asked me about the origins, it was called old time music, even if in its beginning. when the commercial country music started. And so this element of nostalgia was something that these politicians were able to tap into. Again, that was something that in the big story of country music takes some different turns along the way as well. So you've got nostalgia and appreciation for home and those kinds of associations being used in politics for a music that has a lot of different other kinds of political associations, including, associations with labor movements and all kinds of spectrum of politics that starts to change in the 70s when you're finding, for example, Richard Nixon co-opting country music into one particular kind of political point of view. You see Reagan building on that in the 80s, so that country music is starting to take on an association with more right-leaning politics that it really hadn't in its associations up until then. And that has continued with certain artists, although there's, again, a lot of people who are saying, no, these are, the roots are more complicated. The roots are as varied as are the people who love the music. And so that's a quick and dirty sweep of the politics of country music, but and oversimplified, of course, but it's there.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if we go back to the Carter family and Jimmie Rodgers and the 1920s, when we see a lot of the beginnings of country music, we also have the establishment of what is going to be a tremendous platform for upcoming country artists and established country artists in the Grand Ole Opry. And then we move to the 1940s and a platform that you have written about extensively, Louisiana Hayride, is going to come into being, and its significance for a number of artists, perhaps most notably Elvis Presley, is going to be quite profound in the years of its existence. Can you talk a little bit about Grand Ole Opry and Louisiana Hayride and some of these key ways that country artists were able to really get their name out there and start to share their music with the rest of the country?
Yeah, I think, I teach students, 18 to 22-year-olds, and I don't think that it's easy for them to understand the power of radio in its early days, when radio was a new medium, and then there was an explosion of radio stations. There's probably some parallels that someone needs to write about explosions of media now. Podcasting, for example, is everywhere. But at the time, in the early days of radio, there's all these radio stations starting. The federal government comes in through what is now the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and says, okay, this is chaos. We need to do something to sort it all out. That's when they developed this the structure of 50,000 watt stations spread throughout the country, and spread and designated so that you couldn't have what had been happening, which is radio stations trying to cancel each other out and increasing their wattage, and so the power excuse me. So the power of a 50,000 watt radio station like WSM, which is where the Grand Ole Opry started, is really, I think, hard for young generations today to fully grasp. And the fact that it was on AM meant that those signals could go far, far and wide. AM signals bounce up and down on the stratosphere and can be, not heard continuously, but heard in different parts of the world, as opposed to FM, which wasn't around as a radio, as opposed to FM, which tends to just go off 90 miles and then drop off. So AM radio is powerful, and it's bringing these voices across living rooms on the radio stations all over the country. The particular format of the radio barn dance, which is what the Grand Ole Opry is and was, is a variety show type of format. It has a lot in common with vaudeville type variety shows. It's on the radio. Radio exists, and I think this is part of podcasting, is capturing this magic of audio only. There's a structure of your imagination that exists when you're not watching an accompanying video. So that format became very popular. It spread. There were radio barn dances across the country. And one of the last of this generation, and it turns out one of the more influential, was the Louisiana Hayride. So that doesn't even start until after World War II. So the Grand Ole Opry had been on the air for 20 plus years by the time the Louisiana Hayride started. I think this gets back to what does country music look like depending on where your finger is pointed in terms of its center. So when you put your finger down in Louisiana, as opposed to Tennessee, you're looking at a community where there's been roughly 50-50 residents who are Black and white, living for, since the 1900s. I mean, the 19th century, I keep doing that, since the 1800s. And the kind of music that the performers who, this is a segregated time, the performers on the Louisiana Hayride are all white. But the kind of music that they're putting down is different than what you're hearing on the Grand Ole Opry. And there's just a different set of expectations. So, famously, the Grand Ole Opry forbid drums. The Louisiana Hayride's like, sure. Famously, the Grand Ole Opry told Elvis, like, no, thanks, but no thanks. Louisiana Hayride is like, sure. And you look at early pictures, those earliest pictures of Elvis on the Hayride, his band is wearing Western wear. That's the world in which they thought that they fit at the time, because those were that's the paradigm he was stepping into. The music he was making was, of this different impulse that was happening at around that same time, right? We're talking about the mid-50s, and you're seeing these pockets. Eventually we call it rockabilly, or rock and roll, depending on where you are. And so I think region matters a lot when you're looking at history. And if you want the full history, you kind of change your regional perspective to look at that. There's also, there's people like Rose Maddox who were on the Hayride. She's coming from California with her brothers and that band, and they're bringing a whole different vibe to the stage. There's Slim Whitman, who's doing these strange and wonderful explorations in bringing popular music from the Broadway stage to the from the 20s to coming into the early 50s on the Louisiana Hayride, doing his incredible soaring falsetto yodeling. All kinds of wonderful things are happening. And I think on the Louisiana Hayride, there was just an openness to musical sounds and the breadth of potential musical sounds. Ultimately, they were people holding a variety show, right? Filling an auditorium, selling ads, and making the music that made sense at that time. I think that the impact of it resonated quite a bit in terms of expanding the definitions and parameters for country music that followed.
Well, and of course, it wasn't just radio. I know you mentioned podcasting as being a more recent form of media that is being used in some ways to spread country music. But in between, of course, TV played a very significant role. And there were artists such as Johnny Cash, Glen Campbell, Buck Owens, Porter Wagoner. They all had various TV programs, and those shows really played a role in the fabric of country music and the way that country music proceeded over the years as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. Coming a little bit later. So, and if we go back to Shreveport and the Louisiana Hayride, TV is going to come in the late 50s into that market with any kind of energy. And there was, you seeing some changes in that are, maybe they have parallels in other types of media phenomenon, that you think of that kind of well-known history of the talkies causing certain silent film stars to to not be able to make the transition because of their voices. Well, TV probably had some effect on that as well, so that someone like Glen Campbell is presenting a very different, by that time we're in the late 60s or the mid 60s, and the demands of television are a little bit different. And also that's coinciding with a time in country music when there is a overt attempt to infuse elements of popular music into a broader sound. So, the so-called Nashville sound is a widening of musical parameters for country music. You're bringing in background singers and strings and all these elements meant to appeal to a broader audience. TV is mirroring that, or hand in hand with that in terms of who's going to be on the stage and how they're going to appeal. I think Glen Campbell had a very wide appeal, across kind of pop and traditional country audiences. And so that's an interesting middle space that was created there. Johnny Cash he's just all charisma, right?
Absolutely.
Just 100% charisma. But if you look at his show, he was doing some pretty innovative bringing together of impulses as well, including bringing into his show certain episodes that focused on, for example, the troubled treatment of indigenous people in our country. And that was, that's its own story, I think.
Yes, it is. And of course he has, the Ballad of Ira Hayes. So he,
working class issues.
Right.
Indigenous
Working
people.
class issues, indigenous people issues. Those are things that Johnny Cash and other artists have covered as well. But you mentioned the Nashville sound in there. So I guess that's the next place I want to turn, is to Nashville itself, and contrast that with Bakersfield, which is a city that we really haven't mentioned yet. But both of these cities are going to have distinctive sounds and characteristics, at least as far as their place in the country music world goes. And of course, with Nashville, we're going to see the development of Music Row, and Nashville in a lot of ways really becoming the epicenter of the country music universe. And in a lot of ways, that's still the case. And then out west, we're going to see a lot of artists kind of coming up through Bakersfield. Can you talk a little bit about Nashville and Bakersfield and some of the characteristics of country music in those two cities and the significance and roles that those two cities have played in country music over the years?
Yeah. So, and I would certainly say Bakersfield is not my area of expertise, although it's an important part of the big picture of country music. So the short of it is that the places that become epicenters, in this case for country music, are the places where you find capital investment in all of the structures that go along with sustaining a music industry. And places where there have been significant scenes in music where there's not eventually that investment in capital infrastructure, those scenes come and they go. In the case of Nashville, which at the time of, for example, the Louisiana Hayride, and Shreveport was an important draw for musicians from a lot of places to get on that radio station. One oversimplification of the difference between Shreveport and Nashville in the long picture is that there was capital investment in Nashville and there wasn't in Shreveport. That is an oversimplification, but you start to build publishing houses, you start to build recording studios, and And people come there and continue to grow something that there's the fuel to grow it. In Bakersfield, so the Nashville rises. But let's back up. So the Nashville rises to prominence, and over the course of history, you've got different risings of impulses where people are saying, well, there's too many limitations. Because the Nashville concentration of power in studios is over defining what the artists are wanting to do, what they feel like they can do. And so you'll find places where other impulses spring up. So there comes Bakersfield, and there's a group of musicians on the West Coast. They love country music, but they also are, there's a big presence of, Western swing and folk and all kinds of Western types of Mexican types of influences in the West Coast that you wouldn't find in Nashville. And when there's investment, then they can. So the studios start to nurture that sound, and that Bakersfield sound, I think, does incorporate a lot of those different. Maybe it's more Western. If you're still looking at country and Western, it puts the Western back in country and Western a little bit more. But you find that in Austin. Willie Nelson famously moves to Austin and goes, I'm tired of the Nashville strictures, and I want to do something different. And things are able to kind of take root there in their unique way in that region. So yeah.
Well, and with Austin and in Texas, we see the development of outlaw country, and you mentioned Willie Nelson, and of course he played such a significant role in that sort of subgenre of country music really taking off.
Oh yeah. And I think so progressive country is what they would call it in the 70s, as a way of trying to find a word that covered this music that was country, but not country as you were hearing coming out of other places, and certainly had a deep infusion of singer-songwriter, rock. All of these things are happening in the early 70s, and Willie Nelson is right there at the center of it, of what they called it, the cosmic cowboy movement there, where famously speaking, you'd find these clubs in Austin where the cowboys and the hippies are all coming together to listen to the same music and drink beer and dance or what have you. And Austin is an interesting example of what can happen with genre too, and with institutions. So, the Austin city limits, which is another thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and we're talking about the PBS music showcase that started in 1975. We're not necessarily talking about the music festival, which again, a lot of my students would associate Austin city limits with the music festival. And some of them don't even know that there's this long running, amazing music showcase. So the genres merge and change, or institutions that support them merge and change. And I think in Austin, it's been a really interesting history of the scene that rose up with what got to be called progressive country, this institution that emerged because there were people with some energy, some ideas, some investment to make it happen. And then the scene kind of changes, but the institution still exists. And so what is that institution going to do over the next 48 years still running? That institution has adapted and changed to become what it is today, which is a extremely eclectic music showcase that has a reputation for quality across genres. And I think there's a certain subset of audience of music lovers in the country. I would consider myself among them, who are really interested in all kinds of music and love that there's a place that you feel pretty confident if they're on Austin City Limits, they must be good.
If you're interested in starting a website, then use Bluehost. I use Bluehost for placesandprofiles.com, and it's great. Their customer support is quick, responsive, and helpful, and it works well with WordPress, WooCommerce, Google Workspace, and countless other online tools. As an added bonus, if you get your domain name or hosting through my Bluehost link, then I will mention your website on the show and link to your website on placesandprofiles.com, as long as your website is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Bluehost and get your domain name and hosting today by going to placesandprofiles.com/blue. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/blue. But I want to take a moment now to, since we've looked at some geographic locations and their significance with Nashville and with Bakersfield and with Austin. Let's go back chronologically through some artists. So we talked about, for the 1920s and the very beginnings of country music, the influence of the Carter family, the influence of Jimmie Rodgers. We move forward a little bit, start getting to the 30s, 40s, we start seeing the singing cowboys. And maybe the person most associated with that is Gene Autry. And of course, just as we mentioned earlier with Jimmie Davis having appeal and influence outside of music by becoming governor of Louisiana for 2 terms, Gene Autry, of course, is perhaps even more associated with Christmas music and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and things of that sort. Also owned the then California Angels of Major League Baseball. So his influence, of course, spreads far beyond country music. But he's one of these singing cowboys. We have Roy Rogers. We have Bob Wills. Can you talk a little bit about the singing cowboy period of country music and some of the figures that would be most notable from that sort of subgenre of country music?
Well, I think where my mind goes first in that question is coming back to sort of an ongoing theme of, I think, my whole life, is the power of media. So that, the film industry pairing with these, like, we'll just focus on the figure of Gene Autry, is not only spreading sounds of country music far and wide, it's defining their parameters, including how to dress. If you're going to be, if you're going to look like a country music singer, that, I think that's a lasting influence of that. But also expanding the appeal. I mean, there's a lot of attention given to the Nashville sound and that bid for a broader popularity. But I think the singing style and the musical accompaniments of some Gene Autry recordings could just as easily be seen as a precedent for that. And as time goes on, also a source of nostalgia, right? So if we've got a music that's emerging with sort of nostalgic associations, you put them in films. I mean, there are people who then develop that kind of those associations for the film genre itself. Bob Wills is one of my favorite artists from that era. Really doing something else, but I love the Western swing era for also its overt incorporation of genres and impulses from, in this case, swing jazz, into the country music framework. You don't have to talk long about country music before you realize that the whole fixation that we talked about earlier on authenticity and what is and is not is really, for musicians, they're innovating. They're taking what they know, and someone like Bob Wills, and doing something new. And he wasn't alone, but in that impulse, people like Milton Brown are doing it as well. But yeah, musicians are interested in appealing to their audiences and also keeping things fresh. And how do you keep things fresh? Well, you take in influences from all over. And so when you talk about the film industry, you talk about Western swing, those are just different examples of reasons to do that, ways to do that.
Well, and then some ways that we start to see keeping it fresh. So bluegrass, we've mentioned that a couple of times already, but the onset of bluegrass and the influence and significance of Bill Monroe during the 1940s as we move into the post-World War II era, and then the development of honky-tonk country and the significance of Hank Williams, who many will regard as the greatest country artist of all time. So can you talk a little bit about Bill Monroe and bluegrass music, and then Hank Williams and his vast influence and the onset of honky-tonk country in the country music genre?
Yeah. I think Bill Monroe is, starting off with kind of the brother duet, close harmony type of music. And he's really good, and he's got a really good band. And they start taking the kind of string band tradition that they had soaked in and speeding it up, right? And it was very, again, fresh and innovative in taking this music and cranking up the speed, cranking up the virtuosity, and it became really a showman's music, a show person's music that started dubbed a whole genre, right? So people began to emulate what he was doing. I think anytime you're talking about these important figures, it's just really interesting to try to contextualize them and understand them in their time and their place and all the influences. So when you get to Hank Williams, if chronologically, that's right the end of the Western swing era. So you have World War II, you've got a shortage of rubber for tires, a shortage of fuel. It's becoming and a shortage of people, right? Because there's people who might have been in a Western swing band who are suddenly being called away to serve in the armed forces in this conflict. So practically speaking, there are push factors to come up with new ways to approach music making. So what can you do with 3 or 4 band members as opposed to 10 to 12? And then you've also got the widespread amplification of instruments, so that to be heard over a noisy din of people dancing in a bar, amplification means you can do that with fewer people. And so Hank Williams is emerging in those circumstances and is an exquisite songwriter and a good poet and a singer whose voice captured people's hearts and imaginations. He was all charisma too, from from what I've understand of people who had seen him perform. And so he's doing the honky-tonk sound, which is drums, you got your guitar, you got your bass, and these vocals. And so that's that's a marker in sonic quality from Western swing to honky-tonk. Very different sound. And of course, the honky-tonk sound is the one that, in some form or another, influenced everything that followed it.
Well, and speaking of influences of things that follow it, then we start to see the development of rock and roll in the mid to late 1950s. And that's going to have a significant influence on country music. We see the development of rockabilly. And I know we talked about Elvis Presley a little bit earlier when we were discussing Louisiana Hayride and the Grand Ole Opry. But we're going to see Elvis emerging during this time period. We're going to see Jerry Lee Lewis as being a significant figure connected to rockabilly music. We mentioned Johnny Cash earlier as being all charisma, but he's going to have some overlap being in kind of that Memphis setting alongside Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis. So can you talk about how rock and roll and the development of rock and roll influences country music? And then, of course, this is a topic that could be addressed for hours on end, but Elvis, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis coming out of that time period and how significant they were to the trajectory that country music took.
Yeah, if you center that question at the Louisiana Hayride, in terms of the emergence of rock and roll, I mean, what happened at the Hayride was that the audience that would come out on Saturday night to that auditorium to see that live broadcast during Elvis's time there dramatically shifted to a youth audience, and suddenly they were really interested there, and they were behaving in a in a way that was not necessarily had been the social norms of behavior at the Hayride up until then. And I mean, you know, the kind of fan crazed screaming that you associate with even going to a rock concert today. All of that is kind of a shift. So in the short of it is that there was the emergence of rock and roll and the zeitgeist it was for young people in a time when you're just really developing the sense of youth as an audience with buying power and in its own kind of commercial focus. Like, in other words, the idea that you can market music to a youth audience is a pretty new idea there. So all of that kind of shift in audience is a background for, you know, the Nashville sound that we already talked about, the attempt to broaden the appeal, to get a wider share of audience for the music. So that's a very practical term in which you could talk about that question. You know, there's also, I think, the emergence of rock and roll, in my understanding, is a beautiful sonic expression of what in legal terms in our country had been stated, but not enacted fully. So, and what I'm talking about is the Brown versus Board of Education court ruling that, you know, said, you know, separate is not equal, and that charged schools with racial integration. In my mind, rock and roll is a kind of merging in that moment in the 50s. I think it changes as you go, partly because of kind of the paradigm that we started our conversation with. But in that moment, you're looking at all of the impulses of country music and the impulses of R&B kind of coming together in this music that then ignited the passions of people who were young in that era. And that's kind of how I think of it. At one point earlier in the conversation, I think I said, you know, what is interesting and distinctive about any U.S. genre is all of this mixing up of roots. And I've emphasized black and white, but you know, it's not, it's brown too. You know, the influence of Latino music in popular music and country music is also its own story. So to me, those are really important themes to dwell on. You know, later on, country music is a super influential now. But I've recently been even thinking about Dolly Parton and her music. One of the things that happens in her career in the mid 70s, she has her first million-selling album is "Here You Come Again," and the single, she didn't write that one. She wrote the follow-up from the same album, "Two Doors Down." It's hard to position that she was the first country woman to even come close to a million selling album at the time. And now, this day and age, when you hear a song like Jolene, is ubiquitous. You know, you hear that song everywhere, and it's being covered. Like Little Nas X has covered it, and the White Stripes covered it. And you hear it's a meme, or there's a parody of it to get people to take the vaccine. That, all of this. Jolene in 1973 was a number one country hit. It sold 60,000 copies. And so, I mean, country music at that time was not on the same level in terms of its audience reach that we know it to be now. And so if you back up to your question in the 50s and what is the significance of rock and roll? I mean, that it's causing this music to go, okay, if we want to support all these Nashville studios and build this industry, how do we appeal? I think that's when it started, that kind of quest for a broad, far-reaching audience appeal.
Absolutely. A few more things I want to touch on before we wrap up. So, we were looking at the 50s, the influence of rock and roll. We move forward to the 60s, and sadly, we get some devastating tragedies that are going to strike the country music community. Patsy Cline dies in a plane crash alongside Hawkshaw Hawkins and Cowboy Copas. Jim Reeves dies in a plane crash. How did these deaths and the influence of these artists who left us at way too young of an age, how did that shape the country music world moving forward?
Well, I guess, who knows, right? I mean, Patsy Cline and Jim Reeves, I think, were both artists who were really pushing that broadening appeal of country music with their own distinct styles, both of which had a broad appeal. So I think, it's sad and it's tragic. And I think it's impossible to say where their careers would have taken them, any more than my head is with Dolly Parton, any more than anyone could have predicted what, she did last month with, 20 years ago. So, yeah, it's sad and it's tragic, but I don't know that I can answer that question.
Yeah. Well, and of course, Patsy Cline had a tremendous influence in terms of the way that women could play a role in country music. And of course, you've talked about Dolly Parton. So feel free to talk about her a little bit more when you answer this question as well. But two other names I want to mention here, Tammy Wynette and Loretta Lynn. And earlier when we were talking about Johnny Cash and some of the ways that his music spoke about Indigenous rights and the Ballad of Ira Hayes and some controversial issues that he addressed, of course, Loretta Lynn had a song called The Pill that's dealing with contraception. Tammy Wynette with Stand By Your Man. We see kind of, I don't know if an edge is the right word, but at least a willingness to delve into controversial topics as we get more variety of artists to really rise up the charts and become significant influencers in country music.
Well, and that's certainly true. I mean, you also have to add that The Pill was banned on country radio. Yes. Your question brings my mind to a lot of the recent history that has to do with women in country music history. There's been, I think, systemic barriers to women and women's success in country music. And you have these wonderful artists, Loretta Lynn, Tammy Wynette, of course, Dolly Parton, standout artists. But you also have them succeeding in an industry where, a studio might feel like, well, we have a woman, we don't need another one to represent our studio. We have a woman songwriter, and that is a pattern that I think is really the extent to which it was just standard operating procedures are more and more coming into view. And I think the expanded media that we talked about, just with you having a podcast, and this explosion, there's a democratization of media. that are part of what's pushing that reckoning of limitations of these women. So I think the women you name are all the more remarkable for what they came up against, but you also have to, wonder why they're so singular. And I think, there's a well-documented, thanks to a colleague of mine in Canada, Jada Watson, there's a well-documented nosedive of women appearing on country music radio since 2000. So it's not necessarily a phenomenon that is only back in that past. I do think that the women that you named were, incredible trailblazers. And it's no accident that, it was what Tammy, Dolly, and Loretta, they have a wonderful trio project that they did in the 90s. They did it at a time when, because they were all middle-aged or over, they were finding it hard to get played on the radio. And so what happens with Dolly, for example, she's smart enough to take ownership of her recordings, her songwriting, and her whole creative output in such a way that mattered a little less to her. She could continue to make the music she wanted to do. She had a lot that she was happening. So she put out this trio album with her colleagues there. But there's an important backdrop to that and what was happening on mainstream radio as well. Any one of these women you could focus on and talk about their the ways in which they cleared the paths of people today who are making, finding different ways around these barriers. And there's a woman, an author, Marissa Moss, who wrote a book. It's called Her Country, and it's about this whole phenomenon. But she focuses on Casey Musgraves, Maren Morris, and Mickey Guyton, and really kind of contextualizes that big picture in relation to the experiences of these three women. All three of them would call, Dolly and the sisters of a previous generation or two, the clearer of paths for sure.
Well, and a few more male artists I want to mention before we start to wrap up, because these are people that we haven't really talked about, but I'm definitely fond of much of their music. And they also really speak to a lot of these working class themes, blue collar issues, a lot of these sort of personal problems, a lot of the storytelling that really comes out of country music and maybe isn't unique to country music, but at least is very much an identifiable characteristic of country music, as we mentioned earlier. So I know each of these individuals could occupy a tremendous amount of time of discussion. So you don't have to discuss all four of them. But Merle Haggard, George Jones, Buck Owens, Waylon Jennings, these are all people out of sort of like the 60s that really made their mark with tremendous music in the country music world. So if you want to maybe pick one or two of those four between Haggard, Jones, Owens, and Jennings, and talk a little bit about their significance as well.
Well, gosh, I mean, I love to listen to all of those tremendous musicians for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think Waylon Jennings had a way with a song that's pretty hard to parallel. It's hard to find a parallel. So Merle Haggard, I saw him in concert once upon a time, and I just think he has he's a wonderful perpetuator of all that's great about country music. He is a great songwriter who tells a compelling story, who uses his voice beautifully, who knows how to keep a good beat going, whether you're dancing or whether you're just listening. I mean, there's few, all of the people that you named are such great individual stylists. Their voices will never be, replaced. But I think that, they all, they all developed a signature. It reminds me of something that the producer of the Louisiana Hayride famously said that stuck with me. If you don't have it was Horace Logan. If you don't have a style that can be imitated, you don't have a style. And all of those people that you named definitely have a style that can be imitated. So maybe that's a good way to wrap them up.
Yeah. And before we conclude, very quickly, I do want to take a brief look at more recent generations. And before we started recording, we were discussing that this isn't an area maybe that's of quite the same interest level to you. But we have sort of this neo-traditionalist generation. Being in Texas, living in Houston, George Strait's music is just ubiquitous. It is everywhere, and I'm certainly a big fan of George Strait. But we see, other artists coming out of this period: Garth Brooks, Reba McEntire, with this kind of neo-traditionalist style that really catches on. And then more recently, we have new types of music that are influencing country. So we have the influence of hip hop. We have the influence of rap. We have changes in pop music and kind of a newer version of pop music that is influencing country music. So we see artists like Carrie Underwood, Taylor Swift, and these are people whose music I know basically nothing about. Unlike George Strait, where I do know something about the music, with Carrie Underwood and Taylor Swift, I know basically nothing. But what can we say about kind of these more recent generations, this neo-traditionalist group, and then this more recent version that is being influenced by even more types of newer and different music, and having that kind of permeate into the country landscape and change how we think of country music today?
I guess there's pushes and pulls all the time throughout the history of this music, and probably the history of any other music. And with the neo-traditionalists, it's part of that push and pull of, let's reclaim what's at the heart. I usually love the music that's in the name of reclaiming, but it's always, a framing that's in some ways deliberate, and in some ways a reaction to what some people would perceive as an infiltration of other influences that push the music past the boundary of what they could call country, so, maybe that's happening. George Strait's coming out at a time after, country music would have included people winning awards like Olivia Newton-John and John Denver and in the country music sphere. And then there's kind of this pushback of like, oh, well, wait, no, that's not country enough. And let's infuse some more sounds. So that are traditional. And it go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. If you look at the recent controversies about, for example, Lil Nas X and Old Town Road, whether that is or is not a country song, and based on what. There was similar discussions with Beyonce and the song Daddy Song on Lemonade. And I think these discussions and these debates are raising important questions that we started our interview with. And that is the extent to which, when we talk about country music, we're talking about musical definitions versus broader definitions of race and ethnicity and identity. And I think these are important things in our society to talk about. Rap and country music was infused as early as the late 80s. So it's not a brand new thing, because like artists, all artists, people are listening, musicians are listening to what's happening, and if they get an idea of something, way to innovate their sound and give them, in Horace Logan's words, a style that can be imitated, they're going to do it and let the rest work it out. I think the rise of Americana is also an interesting phenomenon recently, where there are musicians who I think sound country and could be called country, but for for reasons. Sometimes it has to do with their gender or their racial identity. Not always, but they'll be put into Americana versus country. I like to think that this democratization of media is accompanying a kind of democratization or of kind of loosening of boundaries of genre, that maybe, good music is good music. The categories tend to be a way to try to reach target audiences. But in the age of streaming, and there's a lot, because I'm, old enough to lament the loss of physical identity for albums or CDs, even in a piece of, and that's coming back too, right? In a piece of practical material goods. But in the age of streaming, there are more fluidity among relationships, or there can be, if people take advantage of the medium that way. And so, yeah, I think the neo-traditionalists, are that at the same, Garth Brooks has a wonderful country sound. He's also the person that you would mark as the rise of so-called stadium country. And in the rise of stadium country, suddenly the expectations for what it means to be a successful artist are skyrocketed in terms of how big of a venue you can fill. And his music is wonderful. But if that's the level of that measures success, what music are you missing in terms of artists who might be appealing to a slightly smaller audience? Again, back to, Jolene sold 60,000 copies back in 1973. But I like the idea of a media world and a genre world where there is room for all kinds of music making from all kinds of musicians. And I think the fact that these forces, you asked me, neo-traditionalists versus people infusing different sounds, all of these forces are just a natural part of the way things happen. And ultimately, if the more musicians who can support themselves creating music, the better off we all are.
All right. Well, this has obviously been a lot to take a look at. I mean, 100 years worth of country music history and influences and figures. So obviously we were just barely scratching the surface there. And there are all sorts of names, iconic names, that we didn't really get to talk about a whole lot. Flatt Scruggs and Hank Snow and Marty Robbins and Charlie Pride and Webb Pierce. I mean, there were any number of people that we did not get to. Connie Smith. So before we wrap up, I want to give you the chance. Is there anything that really stands out from this story of country music and the significance of country music that we've been looking at? Is there anything that really stands out that we did not get to that you feel is essential to be added to the conversation before we part ways today?
I think that the place where we took the conversation related to recent history and recent changes in the industry. I think that to me is a really interesting story to see how it plays out. And it's a story that has implications for our understanding of the past. I think it's important to not make an idol of the way that the story gets told and retold of country or any kind of music. I think that researchers in archives finding new recordings that were overlooked. I'm thinking of, there's a recording by these two women that were done in one of the independent, it was in the North, one of the independent record labels that, to me, ask all kinds of new questions about the story of the blues. And I think that that's in the way research continues. No one's ever, told the last word about anything. And the way that research in archives but also research about what's happening now, can all go hand in hand to help be a force for political good, a force for healing among our divisions in our country. And I think music is a great place, and country music is a great place to focus that energy, to try to refresh the ways that we tell our stories about ourselves and about one another in our country.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Can you take a moment to talk a little bit more about your own work? We've mentioned over the course of this conversation that you've done a lot of research and writing about Dolly Parton, about Austin City Limits, about Louisiana Hayride. But can you take a moment to talk about your own work and what you have that's published and that people could take a look at if they are so inclined?
Okay. Well, so the recent work that I did on Dolly Parton, that's fresh in my mind, so I'll start there, was a bit of a turn for me in terms of it was quick. It was a deep dive. It was based on secondary sources, and so that's a turn for me because my previous works, I've written 2 other monographs they took each about 10 years each. So we're talking about a very different level of project and a type of research. But I loved doing that because that quick deep dive, the format of the book is in moments. So you're not necessarily, it's chronological, but you're not building a continuous narrative. And I felt like I really learned a lot and got a lot of understanding, not just about Dolly, but about the industry and about our society more generally over the 55 plus years that she's been making music, recording interviews, making TV, film appearances, and all of that. In some ways, that was a turn, but I've always been interested in music in relation to region, in relation to media, and in its relation to larger questions about our society. So Austin City Limits was a wonderful project in trying to understand the identity of the show. And then, Louisiana Hayride was probably my first big project. And that's about my hometown. It was about Shreveport. It was about a time before I was born, but it was interesting to me to explore that in relation to what the kind of more typical country music story that you get told, and to let that lead to new questions and new frames. So, and I've done another coffee table book about Austin City Limits with my spouse, who's also a writer, Brandon Laird, and then an edited collection about all the different musics in Shreveport. So the Louisiana Hayride led to another project about Shreveport music. Austin City Limits led to the other project about a coffee table book with the wonderful photos of Scott Newton, who's the longtime photographer on that program. And then who knows where Dolly Parton will lead? But it was certainly a wonderful and inspiring kind of journey to do. So, I'm proud of how it turned out.
Magnificent. So I want to remind everyone that the show notes page for today's episode is placesandprofiles.com/23. So we will have links there to the works that we've mentioned over the course of this conversation. Tracy's work on Dolly Parton, on Louisiana Hayride, on Austin City Limits, and of course links to some of these songs that came up as well, because what conversation about country music could be anywhere close to complete without having actual songs and samples of the music itself readily available. So again, the show notes page for today's episode is placesandprofiles.com/23. And Tracy, I know I kept you over time-wise, but I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. So I greatly appreciate your generosity as far as your time goes. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me, Adam, and good luck with everything that you're doing.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.